Hey folks, welcome back to the reproduction unit. We have looked at male structure and function, female structure and function, and in this video we are going to tackle female hormone regulation. This one's a bit busy. There's a lot going on. We're actually going to split it into two videos. So I'll go through the process in this one. It's probably going to be a little bit overwhelming. And then I will do a second video that I'll get you to watch, still on female hormone regulation, where we summarize sort of this video into like a Word document that you guys can fill out. I'll have it on the website. So let's dive in. The first part of female hormone regulation is actually the same stuff as the male system. So this is a review, been here, done that. Remember, the hypothalamus in your brain secretes gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH. That GnRH is going to talk to your anterior pituitary gland to secrete FSH and LH. And just to hit this review, remember that in the male system, FSH was fresh sperm here, so that's what caused sperm production in the seminiferous tubules, and the luteinizing hormone was what caused the production of testosterone in the interstitial cells. So that was the male system. It turns out it's the same hormones here in the female system, but their role is different. We're not talking about sperm production. We're not talking about testosterone. What we're talking about is the development of eggs and ovaries instead of sperm, and what we're talking about is estrogen and progesterone instead of testosterone. So the names are all kind of the same, but they're unique for females. And here we go. This is all new, and there's lots going on. Again, we'll chat on Zoom. We'll do a review video. It'll all make sense. It'll take some time though. So we've talked about sort of releasing FSH and LH. Let's look at what those do. So FSH in females is going to control what happens in the ovaries. So I want you to keep that in mind, that FSH is responsible for the follicular phase in the ovaries. Now, the follicular phase, we're going to see that we talk about sort of females in terms of their reproductive cycle on a 1-month cycle. And we will talk about things like menses, right, where the endometrium is shed, the bleeding phase of sort of the reproductive cycle. Depending on where you are looking, we have different names. So right now we're talking just about the ovary. So the first little stretch of time is called the follicular phase. And this goes with video number 2, Mr. Waterman's video, but you can always check my PowerPoint as well. Remember that in the ovary, that's where we have the development of the egg, the development of the follicle. So FSH in a female is the hormone that is going to start the growth of the follicle and mature that egg. And remember from Mr. Waterman's video, that we have a primary follicle. The little one with a circle just is short for primary. So primary follicle is like a very immature follicle. Secondary follicle, it's moving along, it's becoming more developed. Then we hit the Graafian follicle stage, which is basically a mature follicle, a mature ovum or egg. It's ready to go. And then ovulation was where we actually release that mature egg. The follicle actually bursts and the egg is physically released from the ovary, and that's where the little fimbriae would grab it and start moving it through the fallopian tube with the help of the cilia. All of that is in video 2. Hopefully you remember that. What's happening here is during the growth of the follicle, it's producing estrogen, one of the main female hormones. And that estrogen actually stays fairly low in terms of how much is being produced until you get to the Graafian follicle, until about day 12, and then there's a big spike. So the amount of estrogen produced is low, 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 boom, and then all of a sudden it goes up really quick. And that spike at day 12 is what's going to cause ovulation. Ovulation, we say, typically happens around day 14 for females. So it spikes at day 12 and it goes up, 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 and then usually around day 14, although it's unique to different people, on day 14, then we release that egg. So that's the job of estrogen. It's being produced in this first little bit here of egg maturation in the ovary. Luteinizing hormone, remember that was also involved in males. It was the one that produced testosterone in those interstitial cells. Luteinizing hormone in females, it stays at a very low level, just like the estrogen did, and it actually follows exactly the same trend as estrogen. So it's pretty darn easy when we think about what are LH and FSH doing in the ovaries. It stays low level, low level, low level, and then around day 12, just like the estrogen, boom, all of a sudden it starts to spike. The level goes way up. And that spike in LH, along with the spike in estrogen, is going to cause ovulation, the release of the mature egg, and again, that's around day 14. Now, once that has happened, remember the follicle ruptures and it turns into the corpus luteum. I like to call it the pineapple ring. I don't know if Waterman called it that in his video. I don't think so. But to me, this looks like a dried pineapple ring, right? So this is what we call the follicle after ovulation has occurred. So it's released the egg, and then the follicle, which surrounds the egg, turns into a structure called the corpus luteum, and it's really just a little hormone factory. That's its job. It's going to produce progesterone and estrogen. So those are the two hormones that are going to be produced, quite a lot of them, by that corpus luteum after ovulation. So day 14 goes by, the female body releases the egg from the ovary, and then the corpus luteum forms, and it starts cranking out a bunch of progesterone and estrogen. So that's what's happening in the ovary. Now, that progesterone and estrogen is going to control what happens in the uterus, right? So here's the ovary. That's where we have that follicle maturing, primary follicle, secondary follicle, Graafian follicle, FSH and LH spike at ovulation. The egg is released. The corpus luteum forms, and then that corpus luteum is going to help build up the endometrium, build up the uterus, so that conditions can be just right for the egg to implant on the off chance that it's fertilized. So estrogen, now that we're in the uterus, we see different names for phases. It controls the follicular or proliferative phase. So the follicular phase was what we called the first little bit in the ovary. Now that we're in the uterus, that corresponds to something called the proliferative phase. And again, when we do this summary, you'll see all of this. So the follicular phase is what's happening with developing the follicle in the ovary. And at the same time, we talk about a proliferative phase because that's what's happening in the uterus. And to proliferate means to grow. So that proliferative phase is where the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, starts to develop. It starts to thicken, starts to develop some blood supply. Again, it's getting ready and it's building itself up for the potential implantation of a fertilized egg. And that occurs for days 5 to 13. We'll see in the cycle. That's exactly the same as the follicular phase. So you might be going, well, I thought this was the start of the cycle. What's weird about sort of biology is the first sort of 4 days, days 1 to 4, is the days of menses. So when the endometrium lining is being shed, that's when a female has her period, right? The endometrium is shed and there's bleeding. So that is actually the start of the cycle. So that's days 1 to 4-ish. And then days 5 to 13, if you're talking about the ovary, we talk about the follicular phase. And if you're talking about the uterus and what's happening there, we give it a different name. It's the proliferative phase, the growth of the endometrium, but it occurs at the same time, that 5 to 13. Remember, day 14 is special. That's the ovulation day. Ovulation being when we release that mature ovum. There is positive feedback during this phase when we have that big spike in FSH and LH. That's the only way you can get a big build of hormones to happen. It's like cranking up that volume knob. Remember I talked about the negative feedback with testosterone. Here you want to crank up the FSH and the LH because you want ovulation to happen. So it's the only time where you have this positive feedback. It's just to ramp up those two things until ovulation happens, and then you switch back over to a negative feedback, which is what's usually happening. So progesterone. Remember, this is one of the hormones that's produced by the corpus luteum. So now we're talking about after ovulation, after day 14. So the egg has been released. The follicle turns into that little pineapple ring looking structure, in that picture anyways. And it starts cranking out this really important hormone called progesterone. And progesterone is going to control even further thickening and building in the uterus. And this is called the secretory phase. Why do we call it the secretory phase, or secretory, however you want to call it, tomato, tomato? Actually, I should maybe take a step back even. It is called the secretory or secretory phase if you're looking at the uterus. If you're talking about what's happening in the ovary, we call it the luteal phase. So again, it's kind of weird, right? It's like we give the same stretch of time different names depending on where in the female reproductive structure you're looking. It's called the luteal phase in the ovary because you're developing the corpus luteum. So that's where that comes from, right? Luteal phase is the corpus luteum forming. And I'm not going to talk about that in this slide. We're going to talk specifically about the secretory or secretory phase. What happens in the uterus with the secretory phase, and this is days 15 to 28, so it's the back half of the female reproductive cycle, is the endometrium. So now we're talking about that phase. Secretory. The endometrium, it fully matures. So you get lots of blood supply to the endometrium because if that fertilized egg implants, we need to have lots of nutrients and gas exchange happening with it. And it also becomes really sticky with mucus. You want it to be sticky so that egg can actually implant and actually get stuck there, right? Because it doesn't want to move after it sticks or attaches. And these special cells called goblet cells make mucus. So we get a big blood supply, we make it nice and sticky with mucus. That is called the secretory phase in the uterus. And that secretory phase is happening because the corpus luteum is making progesterone. Right? That corpus luteum, the little dried pineapple ring, it's a hormone factory. It's cranking out all this progesterone, which is building up the uterus, the endometrial lining. There you go. Trying to get the optimal environment to implant the ovum. And again, that only happens. Remember, you only implant the ovum if it's fertilized. If it's not, then it's shed during menses, during the period phase. The negative feedback is happening throughout definitely the back half of this cycle. So during the luteal phase, this is in the ovary, estrogen and progesterone are going to go back to the anterior pituitary, go back to the hypothalamus, and sort of keep things regulated. Just like testosterone and inhibin went back to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and prevented the male system from just cranking out huge amounts of testosterone. Here, we want to have negative feedback through most of the cycle we want to regulate the volume level, right, of the music playing. The only time we don't, the only time the female system sort of lets it crank up is just days 12 through 14. And those were the days where we have that spike in LH and FSH. And that caused ovulation. So ovulation requires the body to sort of grab that volume knob and just crank it up only for a couple of days, and then it goes back and it cranks it down to an acceptable level. So here's a little chart, and we're going to make something like this in the second video. This first chart is showing you what's happening in the ovary, right? And it's showing you what's happening with FSH and LH. So here we've got a negative feedback, right? They're sort of at low levels. Don't worry about little bounces like that. Here they're at fairly low levels, negative feedback. And you'll notice right around ovulation, this would be day 14, you see this big spike. So that's the only little bit of time, right? We have a spike in FSH and LH. You can see the LH spikes way more than the FSH, but they both have nice little bumps and spikes there. That spike is because it's the only time where you actually have a positive feedback. Just for a couple of days. And that causes ovulation. So those two things you can see are causing the egg to be released, ovulation. And then once you have ovulation, hey look, the corpus luteum is forming. What does the corpus luteum do? Well, its big job is to make progesterone. And you can see that progesterone levels are basically zero until the corpus luteum forms. And then you can see that as the corpus luteum forms, progesterone goes up, 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 and it actually stays at quite a high level. So progesterone is made by the corpus luteum after ovulation. You can see estrogen here. It spiked around ovulation. It drops off a little bit, and then it stays at like a medium level. So in that review video, we'll talk about that. Progesterone is at 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. After ovulation, it actually, I won't say it spikes, but it gets high and it stays high for a while. Estrogen spikes and then stays like at a medium level. Showing you what's happening in the uterus here at the bottom. We have menses, so this is like a girl or female having her period, right? Bleeding, shedding the endometrium lining. The follicular phase is actually what we would call that stage in the ovary. So this is actually not a good set of names to have, because the follicular phase is what we call it in the ovary. If we were talking about the uterus, we would call it the proliferative phase. And then the luteal phase is what's happening in the ovary. It's the development of the corpus luteum. If we're talking about the uterus, we call it the secretory phase. Again, kind of confusing. We'll do a summary. Don't sweat it. Proliferative phase in the uterus, you're building up the thickness of the uterine lining. And in the secretory phase, you really build up that uterine lining thickness. You can see the thickness maximizes, right? Follows the trend sort of progesterone. It gets really thick. It gets a big blood supply. You get all that mucus from the goblet cells. And then it's actually this little part, just in case you're wondering, at some point, the female body has put all of this energy into building up the uterus, right? You can see that we're building. And at some point, if you don't have implantation of a fertilized egg, the female body gives up and says, okay, we're gonna take all this apart. We're gonna start from scratch. And when progesterone and estrogen drop off, so there's a drop in progesterone and estrogen. They basically go down to zero. That drop in progesterone and estrogen is what causes menses, right? So as soon as those hormone levels drop off, as soon as the body says, okay, we're done, right? We've put all this time investment in and nothing has happened, right? The female didn't have a fertilized egg implant. Then those hormone levels drop off, and that's when a female's period starts. And then it starts up again, right? This 28-ish day cycle. And then it gives up, you shed the lining, and then it starts again. So you just go over and over and over on about a monthly cycle, right? So we might get pregnant, there might be a fertilized ovum. No, there's not. Let's start from scratch. And it just happens over and over and over. So the corpus luteum, that little hormone factory, it's making estrogen, and progesterone is the big one. But it is also making estrogen. And here, I got ahead of myself. At day 28-ish, it stops making progesterone and estrogen. That's the trigger for the body to sort of give up. And once the body or the corpus luteum stops making the progesterone and estrogen, so right here, corpus luteum gives up the ghost, right? Says, no, we're done. It stops making the progesterone, the estrogen, and that causes menstruation, right? Menses, bleeding. So that's just getting rid of the endometrium lining in the uterus and starting from scratch. 50% of women report pain when that happens, right? Pain during their period. My wife, I know, especially when she was a teenager, used to get wicked cramping. I'll share that with you because we're all adults here. We're all friends. I don't think she'd mind. But she used to spend time like just curled up in a ball in the fetal position, and I would just rub her back, and we would put hot bags on her lower back, and it was not fun. In some women, it can cause PMS. So it makes them a little bit moody. It makes them not feel good. My wife, again, used to get really bad cramps, but she wasn't really cranky with it. But I do know females who sometimes get cranky, and it's like, oh, geez, right? PMS, you got to watch out for so-and-so. And it's not really their fault, right? It's this weird imbalance of hormones happening in their body that can cause mood swings in a lot of females. So here's what's happening in the ovary. So just looking at the ovary. We have the follicular phase in days 5 through 13. That's where FSH is causing development of the follicle. That should be pretty easy, right? Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicle development. Hey, it's right there in the name. And the follicle secretes some estrogen. Day 14 is where you have a spike in LH and also a spike in FSH and also a spike in estrogen. It turns out it is actually the increase in estrogen causes the big spike in LH, that the order doesn't really matter, but we have a spike in those three hormones. Those three hormones, when they spike at day 14, causes the Graafian follicle to burst, which releases that mature ovum. That is ovulation, right? The release of the egg with the spike of those hormones. And then your LH and FSH, they drop back down. And then we enter the luteal phase for the rest of the cycle. And that's where you've got the corpus luteum. Remember, that's where luteal comes from, luteal luteum. You've got the corpus luteum, which is making progesterone and estrogen. And that's really important to build up the endometrium in the uterus. So that's what we call the names in the ovaries, right? And when we look at sort of the same time periods in the uterus, we give them different names. Again, I don't know why, it's kind of confusing, but if you're looking at the ovary, then there's a follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. Compare, contrast that with, throw this in there. So the hormones made in the ovary are going to control what happens in the uterus. So FSH and LH control the ovary. The ovary, in turn, controls what happens in the uterus. So there's kind of a hierarchy in terms of, well, why do things happen? The brain controls FSH and LH, which controls the ovary, which controls the uterus. So the uterine cycle, we have menses, We don't really talk about that in the ovary because nothing's happening in the ovary during menses. Menses, menstruation, bleeding, flow. It's got all kinds of different names. That's the first sort of 4 or 5 days. And that is the bleeding phase where you shed the endometrium. And that happens because progesterone and estrogen drop off. So remember the corpus luteum, it sort of gives up. It stops making, here I said it slows, but it really drops right off. It stops making progesterone and estrogen, and that causes the endometrium to be shed, right? Bleeding. Then the proliferative phase coincides with the follicular phase in the ovary, but in the uterus, the proliferative phase is where estrogen from the follicle is starting to rebuild that endometrium. The body is starting from scratch and it's starting to build things up. And then after ovulation, remember we don't really talk about ovulation in the uterus because that was the egg being released from the ovary. The uterus is kind of doing its own thing. We hit the secretory or secretory phase where progesterone is going to cause just like maximum thickening and maximum mucus production of that endometrium. So increased blood vessels, mucus production, you get that endometrium fully mature, trying to sort of get it totally ready and get it the conditions perfect for potential implantation of that fertilized ovum. So here's the summary. FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary control the ovary. So the ovary ripens the ovum, the follicular phase, it gets released on day 14, ovulation. Estrogen and progesterone. That shouldn't actually say progesterone. I'm going to take that out. Estrogen from the ovary. Nope, I'll lie. We can leave that in there. It's not really the ovary, it's the corpus luteum, but I guess that's in the ovary. So we'll leave that in there. I have no editing ability with this old program, so sorry. If I could edit, I would fix that. But you get the real deal here. So estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone is from the corpus luteum. So I guess we're still talking ovary. Controls what happens in the uterus, that secretory phase, thicken the endometrium, and then fully mature it. And again, there's that picture that takes us to the end. Again, kind of long, sorry, probably a little bit confusing, but we will go over a summary page in the next video. So for the next video, the second video that is female reproductive hormones, make sure you watch it. Make sure if you have the ability, you can print out the sort of review page. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a document that looks kind of like this. We'll simplify things a little bit, but we'll label names and levels of hormones. It'll be a shorter video, and I think that'll help it solidify in your brain. Again, there's a lot going on here. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. It's like, wow, what's going on in the ovary? What's going on in the uterus? What kind of gonadotropic releasing hormones are we talking about? What kind of hormones are being produced by the follicle or the corpus luteum? There's lots going on and they're all linked. So try out the second video, follow along, but really do join me in a Zoom meeting, right? Feel free to log yourself on this week for our Zoom meetings, and let's chat and go over it. Because in real time, I guarantee I can make it make sense for you. So I hope to see you in our next Zoom meeting, or fire me an email. That works too. But let's touch base and make sure this makes sense. Have fun learning about the craziness, the amazing complexity of the female hormone reproductive cycle.